What happens when everyone around you believes you're too weak to succeed? When your own teammates look at you with doubt in their eyes? When instructors whisper that you don't belong? Most people would crumble under that pressure. Most would quit before the real test even began. But some people are forged differently. Some people take every insult, every dismissive laugh, every cruel comment, and transform it into fuel. They let the fire of determination burn so bright that it blinds those who doubted them. This is the true story of a woman who walked into one of the most challenging military training environments in the world. A place where grown men had broken down and quit. A place where physical and mental limits are pushed beyond what most people think is humanly possible. They looked at her small frame and soft voice and decided she was already defeated. They were wrong. Dead wrong. What they didn't know was that behind those quiet eyes burned the heart of a warrior. What they couldn't see was the steel in her spine, forged by years of being underestimated. What they failed to understand was that she had already survived battles they couldn't imagine. By the time they realized their mistake, she had already rewritten the rules of what was possible. She had already proven that strength isn't measured in pounds or inches. She had already shown them that the greatest weapon in any fight isn't muscle or size. It's a refusal to give up. This is her story. The story of how a woman they mocked as weak became a legend. The story of how she took down 5 Marines and changed everything they thought they knew about what it means to be strong. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Marine Corps training facility as Sarah Chun stepped off the transport bus. At 5 feet 3 inches and weighing barely 120 pounds, she looked more like a college student than someone about to enter one of the military's most demanding programs. The other recruits towered over her, their broad shoulders and muscular frames making her appear even smaller by comparison. "You sure you're in the right place, sweetheart?" called out Sergeant Martinez from across the courtyard. His voice carried a mixture of amusement and genuine concern. "The yoga studio is about 10 miles that way." A chorus of chuckles erupted from the group of male recruits standing nearby. Sarah felt their eyes on her, measuring, judging, already writing her off as a mistake in the system. She had heard it all before. In high school, they said she was too small for the soccer team. In college, professors questioned whether she had the physical presence for law enforcement. Now, here at the elite Marine Corps close combat training program, the doubts were louder than ever. Sarah adjusted her gear bag on her shoulder and walked forward with steady steps. She had learned long ago not to respond to the taunts with anger. Instead, she let them fuel something deeper, something that had been growing inside her since she was a child, watching her father come home from his tours overseas, sharing stories of honor and service that made her dream of wearing the uniform herself. "Chun, Sarah," she announced to the drill instructor, checking names off his clipboard. "Reporting for advanced combat training, sir." Master Sergeant Williams looked up from his list, his weathered face showing surprise. "You're Chun?" "I expected." He paused, clearly trying to be diplomatic. "Well, I expected someone different." The 5 Marines who had volunteered for this experimental training program watched the exchange with growing amusement. This was supposed to be a pilot program testing new combat techniques, and they had expected to work alongside other seasoned fighters. Instead, they were looking at what appeared to be a lost civilian. Corporal Jake Murphy, a mountain of a man from Texas, nudged his buddy Lance Corporal Rodriguez. $20 says she's gone by lunch, he whispered. Rodriguez grinned and shook his head. "I'll take that bet, but I'm saying she doesn't make it past the first fitness test." Lance Corporal Davis, known for his brutal honesty, stepped forward. "Ma'am, with all due respect, this program has a 90% failure rate among men who've been training for years. Maybe you should consider starting with something more suitable." Sarah looked up at him, her dark eyes steady and calm. "Thank you for the concern, Corporal. I'll keep that in mind." The other 2 Marines, Sergeant Johnson and Corporal Williams, exchanged glances. They had seen overconfident recruits before, people who thought military training was like what they saw in movies. Most of them learned quickly that real combat preparation was something entirely different. But there was something in Sarah's quiet confidence that puzzled them. She wasn't boasting or trying to prove anything with words. She was just there, ready to begin. Master Sergeant Williams blew his whistle, calling the group to attention. Listen up, people. This is a 6-week intensive program designed to push you beyond your limits. We're testing new hand-to-hand combat techniques, advanced tactical scenarios, and psychological endurance protocols. Half of you won't finish the first week. He began walking among the recruits, his voice carrying across the training ground. This isn't about your college degrees or your previous experience. This is about finding out what you're really made of when everything goes wrong, when you're exhausted, scared, and completely out of your comfort zone. Sarah stood at attention, her posture perfect despite her small stature. She had spent months preparing for this moment, not just physically but mentally. While other candidates had focused on building muscle mass, she had studied the psychology of combat, the science of leverage and momentum, the art of using an opponent's strength against them. Her father had taught her the first lesson when she was 12 years old, after a particularly bad day at school where bigger kids had made her life miserable. "Sarah," he had said, sitting her down in their garage next to his old punching bag, "the strongest person isn't always the one who wins the fight. The one who wins is the one who refuses to give up." That lesson had carried her through 4 years of martial arts training, 2 degrees in criminal justice and psychology, and countless hours of studying military tactics and history. She wasn't here by accident, and she wasn't here to prove a point to anyone except herself. The first exercise was a basic fitness assessment. Push-ups, sit-ups, pull-ups, and a 3-mile run. Sarah watched as the Marines performed their tests with the casual confidence of men who had been doing this for years. Murphy knocked out 50 push-ups without breaking a sweat. Rodriguez's pull-ups looked effortless. Davis finished his run at a pace that would have challenged most college athletes. When Sarah's turn came, the group watched with barely concealed amusement. She approached the pull-up bar, her small hands barely able to wrap around the thick metal. The silence was deafening as she began her first repetition. 1, 2, 3. The Marines stopped talking among themselves and began to pay attention. Sarah's form was perfect, her breathing controlled, her movements precise and economical. 5, 6, 7. Murphy stopped counting under his breath and just stared. By the time Sarah reached 15 pull-ups, the amusement had faded from their faces. When she hit 20, Sergeant Johnson whispered to Davis, "How is she doing that?" When she completed 25 and dropped from the bar without showing any signs of serious fatigue, the courtyard was completely silent. "Well," Master Sergeant Williams said, making a note on his clipboard, "that was unexpected." Sarah's push-ups were equally impressive, not because of raw power, but because of technique and endurance. She had learned to maximize efficiency, to use perfect form to accomplish more with less effort. While the Marines relied on brute strength, Sarah relied on precision and mental discipline. The 3-mile run revealed another surprise. Sarah didn't try to keep up with the pace set by the larger men. Instead, she found her own rhythm, a steady, sustainable speed that she could maintain mile after mile. While some of the Marines started strong but faded in the final stretch, Sarah finished with energy to spare, her breathing still controlled and even. "Beginner's luck," Murphy muttered as they gathered for the afternoon briefings. But there was less conviction in his voice than there had been that morning. The real test came during the first combat training session. Master Sergeant Williams had paired them up for basic grappling exercises, and Sarah found herself facing Corporal Davis. At 6 feet 2 inches and 210 pounds, he outweighed her by nearly 90 pounds. "I'll go easy on you," Davis said as they moved to the center of the mat. He meant it kindly, but Sarah could see the pity in his eyes. He was already thinking about how to help her save face when the inevitable happened. "Thank you," Sarah replied. "But that won't be necessary. What happened next will be talked about for years in the training facilities." Davis approached the exercise with the casual confidence of someone who had never lost a grappling match to anyone under 180 pounds. He reached out to establish his grip, expecting to use his size advantage to control the engagement from the beginning. Sarah moved like water around his grasp. Her years of martial arts training had taught her that in grappling, position was more important than power. While Davis tried to use his strength to overpower her, Sarah used his momentum against him, redirecting his energy and finding angles that his larger frame couldn't defend against. Within 30 seconds, Davis found himself on his back, Sarah's arm locked around his throat in a textbook rear naked choke. The tap came quickly, more from surprise than from any real danger, but the message was clear. "Lucky shot," Rodriguez called out, but his voice lacked confidence. For the second round, Sarah faced Murphy. This time, the Marine approached more cautiously, but the result was the same. Sarah's technique was simply superior. She moved with the precision of someone who had spent years studying not just how to fight, but how to think during a fight. The watching Marines began to realize that what they were seeing wasn't luck or beginner success. This was skill developed through years of dedicated training and study. Sarah wasn't trying to prove she was as strong as them. She was proving she was better. By the end of the first week, the dynamic in the training group had completely changed. Sarah had outperformed every other recruit in tactical problem-solving exercises, showed superior endurance in long-distance training runs, and demonstrated technical skills that impressed even the instructors. But, more importantly, she had begun to change the way her fellow Marines thought about what it meant to be strong. During evening discussions, she shared insights about leverage, timing, and psychological warfare that made them reconsider their own approaches to combat. "Where did you learn all this?" Sergeant Johnson asked one evening as they cleaned their equipment. There was genuine respect in his voice now, replacing the condescension that had been there just days earlier. "My father always told me that if you can't be the biggest person in the room, you better be the smartest," Sarah replied. "So I studied. I learned from everyone I could find. I prepared." Rodriguez, who had initially bet against her lasting the first day, shook his head in amazement. "I've been doing this for 8 years, and I've never seen anyone adapt that quickly." But Sarah knew the real tests were still coming. The first week had been about establishing her credibility. The coming weeks would be about proving she could handle not just the physical challenges, but the psychological pressure of extended combat scenarios. As she lay in her bunk that night, Sarah thought about the journey that had brought her here. Every person who had told her she was too small, too weak, too different to succeed in a man's world had unknowingly contributed to her preparation. They had given her the gift of low expectations, the advantage of being underestimated. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove that strength came in many forms. But tonight, for the first time since arriving at the facility, Sarah allowed herself a small smile. She was no longer the girl they had mocked. She was becoming something they hadn't expected and couldn't ignore. The transformation was just beginning. The second week of training brought a new level of intensity that tested every recruit's mental and physical limits. Master Sergeant Williams had designed scenarios that went far beyond basic combat techniques. These were psychological warfare exercises designed to break down barriers and reveal what each person was truly made of when pushed to their absolute limits. Sarah woke before dawn each morning, using the quiet hours to practice meditation techniques she had learned from studying ancient warrior traditions. While the Marines relied on their years of military conditioning to handle stress, Sarah had developed her own methods for maintaining mental clarity under pressure. She understood that the mind was the most important weapon in any conflict, and she had spent years learning how to control hers. The first major test came in the form of a 72-hour continuous exercise that combined sleep deprivation, physical exhaustion, and complex problem-solving under extreme stress. The recruits were divided into 2 teams and dropped into a simulated combat zone where they had to complete a series of increasingly difficult missions while being constantly harassed by instructors playing enemy forces. Sarah found herself teamed with Corporal Williams and Lance Corporal Rodriguez, while the other team consisted of Murphy, Davis, and Sergeant Johnson. The initial briefing was simple: navigate through hostile territory, gather intelligence, and return to base without being captured. What the recruits didn't know was that the instructors had designed the exercise to be nearly impossible, with the real test being how each person handled failure and frustration. 8 hours into the exercise, both teams were exhausted, hungry, and operating on almost no sleep. The simulated enemy forces had captured half of Rodriguez's equipment, and Sarah's team was falling behind on their mission objectives. Tensions were rising, and the carefully maintained military discipline was beginning to crack. "This is impossible," Rodriguez muttered as they crouched behind a concrete barrier, trying to figure out their next move. They got us outnumbered and outgunned. There's no way we can complete this mission. Corporal Williams nodded in frustration. I've been through a lot of training exercises, but this is beyond anything I've seen. I think they're setting us up to fail. Sarah studied the tactical maps spread out before them, her mind working through possibilities that her teammates couldn't see. While they were focused on the immediate obstacles, she was thinking several moves ahead, looking for patterns in the enemy's behavior and weaknesses in their positioning. "What if we're approaching this wrong?" she said quietly. Both Marines looked at her with exhaustion-clouded eyes. What if the point isn't to complete the mission as designed, but to adapt the mission to what's actually possible? She pointed to a section of the map where the enemy patrols seemed less frequent. "Look at the timing here. Every 43 minutes, there's a 7-minute gap in their coverage. That's too precise to be accidental. I think they want us to notice it." Rodriguez squinted at the map, trying to see what she was seeing. "You think it's a trap?" "No," Sarah replied, her voice gaining confidence. "I think it's a test. They want to see if we can identify opportunities that others would miss, if we can think beyond the obvious tactics." What followed was a display of strategic thinking that impressed both her teammates and the observing instructors. Sarah had identified a pattern that allowed them to move through the exercise area in ways that the enemy forces hadn't anticipated. Instead of trying to overpower their opponents, she found ways to avoid confrontation entirely while still achieving their objectives. Her approach required patience and precise timing, qualities that her larger, more aggressive teammates initially struggled with. But as the hours passed and Sarah's tactics proved successful, Williams and Rodriguez began to trust her judgment completely. They started following her lead without question, recognizing that her unconventional thinking was giving them advantages they couldn't achieve through traditional military approaches. Meanwhile, the other team was struggling with a more direct approach. Murphy's natural aggression and Davis's experience made them formidable in straightforward combat scenarios, but the exercise was designed to neutralize those advantages. Their repeated frontal assaults were being repelled, and their frustration was growing with each failed attempt. By the 36-hour mark, Sarah's team had completed 2 of their 3 mission objectives, while the other team was still struggling with their first. But the real revelation came during the final 12 hours of the exercise, when sleep deprivation and physical exhaustion had pushed everyone to their breaking point. Rodriguez collapsed during a reconnaissance mission, overcome by exhaustion and dehydration. Williams was dealing with an ankle injury that made movement difficult. Sarah found herself essentially carrying her team through the final phase of the exercise, making decisions for all 3 of them while maintaining her own performance standards. The instructors watched in amazement as Sarah coordinated her team's movements, compensated for their injuries and limitations, and still managed to complete their final mission objective. She was operating on the same lack of sleep and physical stress as everyone else, but her mental discipline allowed her to function at a higher level than recruits who had years more military experience. When the exercise finally ended, both teams gathered for debriefing in a state of complete exhaustion. Master Sergeant Williams looked at the results with unconcealed surprise. Sarah's team had completed all 3 mission objectives and returned with valuable intelligence about enemy positions. The other team had managed 1 successful mission and had lost 2 members to simulated capture. "Chun," Williams called out as the recruits prepared to return to their barracks for desperately needed rest. "I need to speak with you privately." Sarah followed the Master Sergeant to his office, wondering if she had somehow violated protocol during the exercise. Instead, Williams pulled out a thick file and placed it on his desk. "I've been looking at your background," he said, studying her with new interest. "Martial arts training since age 8. Bachelor's degree in psychology with a focus on crisis management. Master's degree in strategic studies. You didn't just wander into this program by accident, did you?" Sarah remained at attention, unsure how much she should reveal about her long-term goals. "Sir, I've been preparing for military service for most of my life. This program represents an opportunity to test whether that preparation was adequate." Williams leaned back in his chair, processing this information. "Adequate? Chun, what you did out there wasn't adequate. It was exceptional. Your team performance scores are higher than any I've seen in 15 years of running these exercises." He opened the file and showed her evaluation sheets filled with notes from multiple instructors. Every single observer commented on your tactical thinking and leadership under pressure. But what really caught their attention was how you adapted your leadership style to work with teammates who have completely different strengths and weaknesses. Sarah felt a mix of pride and uncertainty. The praise was gratifying, but she sensed there was more to this conversation than simple recognition of good performance. "Sir, is there a problem with my participation in the program?" "Problem?" Williams laughed. "Chun, there's no problem. But I think you should know that word about your performance is traveling up the chain of command. This was supposed to be a standard training evaluation, but you've turned it into something much more significant." Over the following days, Sarah noticed changes in how she was treated by both instructors and fellow recruits. The open skepticism had disappeared completely, replaced by genuine respect and curiosity about her methods. Murphy, who had initially bet against her lasting a single day, began asking her for advice on tactical planning. Davis sought her input on hand-to-hand combat techniques that could work against larger opponents. But perhaps the most significant change was in how the Marines began to work together as a unit. Sarah's success had forced all of them to reconsider their assumptions about effective teamwork. Instead of competing against each other to prove individual superiority, they began collaborating to maximize their collective effectiveness. The third week brought urban warfare scenarios that tested their ability to operate in close quarters against multiple opponents. Sarah's performance in these exercises was nothing short of revolutionary. Her understanding of space, timing, and psychological pressure allowed her to control situations that should have been impossible given her physical limitations. During one memorable exercise, Sarah was placed in a scenario where she had to neutralize 5 armed opponents in a confined space. The simulation was designed to test reaction times and tactical decision-making under extreme pressure. Most recruits approach such scenarios by trying to overpower their opponents through speed and aggression. Sarah took a completely different approach. She used the confined space to her advantage, positioning herself so that the opponents interfered with each other's movement. She exploited blind spots and psychological pressure points, causing her opponents to make mistakes that she could capitalize on. Within minutes, all 5 opponents had been neutralized without Sarah having to rely on superior physical strength. The observing instructors were speechless. Master Sergeant Williams later described it as the most impressive individual performance he had ever witnessed in simulated combat. But for Sarah, it was simply the natural result of years of study and preparation finally being put to the test. Rodriguez approached her after the exercise, shaking his head in amazement. "How did you even know that would work? I've never seen anything like that." "Most people fight the opponents they can see," Sarah replied. "But the real enemy is usually the assumptions you make about what's possible. Once you let go of those assumptions, a lot more options become available." Sergeant Johnson, who had initially questioned whether Sarah belonged in the program, found himself seeking her advice on scenarios that had nothing to do with combat. Her analytical approach to problem solving was proving valuable in logistics planning, team coordination, and strategic thinking exercises. "You know what's funny?" he said during one of their evening discussions. "We all thought this program was about proving how tough we were. But you've shown us it's really about proving how smart we can be when everything goes wrong." The psychological evaluation sessions that took place during the 4th week revealed even more about Sarah's unique approach to military service. While most recruits focused on their individual capabilities and achievements, Sarah consistently demonstrated an understanding of herself as part of a larger system. She saw her role not as proving her individual superiority, but as maximizing the effectiveness of any team she joined. Dr. Martinez, the program's psychological evaluator, noted that Sarah's responses showed an unusual combination of confidence and humility. She was completely aware of her capabilities and limitations, but she approached challenges with a mindset focused on adaptation and continuous learning rather than validation of existing skills. Most exceptional performers have ego involvement in their success, Dr. Martinez explained to Master Sergeant Williams during their weekly review meeting. They need to prove that they're better than everyone else. Chen is different. She's focused on becoming whatever the situation requires, regardless of how that reflects on her personal status. This psychological profile was beginning to attract attention from beyond the training facility. Sarah's combination of technical skill, tactical thinking, and leadership adaptability represented exactly the kind of capabilities that modern military operations demanded. But she remained focused on the immediate challenges of the training program, unaware that her performance was being discussed at levels far above Master Sergeant Williams. As the fourth week drew to a close, Sarah reflected on how much had changed since that first morning when she stepped off the transport bus. The Marines who had once mocked her were now seeking her guidance. The instructors who had questioned her place in the program were now using her performance as an example for future recruits. But, more importantly, Sarah had proven to herself that years of preparation and study could overcome almost any physical disadvantage when combined with mental discipline and strategic thinking. She had shown that strength wasn't just about muscle mass and aggressive tactics. Real strength was about adapting to circumstances, maximizing opportunities, and never accepting that any situation was impossible to improve. The final 2 weeks of the program would bring the ultimate tests, scenarios designed to push every recruit beyond anything they had previously experienced. But Sarah was no longer the uncertain young woman who had arrived at the facility. She had become something that none of them had expected, a warrior whose greatest weapons were her mind and her refusal to accept limitations that others considered absolute. The Marines who had once ridiculed her weakness were beginning to understand that they had been looking at strength all wrong. And Sarah was just getting started.